To be honest, I didn't even know what a Zionist was. All I knew was that I had been asked to sign a pledge for Israel when I first became a candidate for Congress. And after refusing to do so, my congressional career became trench warfare, hand-to-hand combat, just to remain
Zionists
in
have
Congress.
claimed this pledge was like a treaty. However, I would like to point out that she was not elected into office yet and that this is a precondition before the oath of office and before the election process begins. I am not sure if this is a precondition for every member or this practice is still going on, but to be sure, please contact your representatives today.
I asked the question then, what did the administration know and when did it know it about the tragic events of September 11th? I was in Washington that day and experienced the most chaotic and confusing day of my life. But my gut told me that this was nothing new. I was experiencing what I had read about so many times before. I figuratively stepped outside of myself and watched as we members of Congress gathered on the Capitol steps. I was a critical observer at the members-only briefings, and I noticed everything. When I traveled to Europe and England, I encouraged citizen investigations of 911, and I learned that to question 911 was to be labeled an anti-Semite. Even more bizarre, those who questioned the tragedy were equated with Holocaust deniers, and I wondered why. By demanding an independent investigation of what happened on September 11th, I became a political pariah. I was vilified in the press, and the noose tightened around my district. The pro-Israel lobby found someone to run against me, gave her over $1 million for her campaign, and then managed to make the election turn out the wrong way.
The greatest nation on earth cannot keep conducting its business by drifting from one manufactured crisis to the next.
Did he just fucking say that? Is this fucking happening?
The greatest nation on earth cannot keep conducting its business by drifting from one manufactured crisis to the next.
Being evacuated. President Bush is coming up from Sarasota. He spoke briefly. They were checking out Air Force One, and then he was coming on that flight. But again, all over the country now, flights have been suspended for at least 7 hours. Miranda?
Now what they're saying is that it's obviously a terrorist attack and that they're investigating into connections with Osama bin Laden.
Can someone please tell me what the fuck these buttons mean? They look like some kind of Jewish symbol. Notice all the usual suspects, who were targeted by Israel in the past and future, have to be contacted and all declare themselves innocent, and they go on to talk about how the stronger countries, Israel and the United States, are always targeting the weaker ones through false flags. Sometimes it works. 9/11 was one example.
They're saying is that it's obviously a terrorist attack and that they're investigating into connections with Osama bin Laden.
From Gaza, Amy, comes word that
this is the example. Here we go.
Denied that Hamas had any connection with the attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. He says, we and Hamas, our battle is on Palestinian land. We are not ready to move our battle out of the occupied Palestinian territories. He said U.S. policies against the weaker peoples of the world were to blame for the aircraft attacks on 2 major U.S. cities. And he said U.S. policies against the weaker peoples of the world were to blame for the aircraft attacks on 2 major U.S. cities. And one in Kabul, Afghanistan, Associated Press says that the Taliban rulers today condemned the attacks in New York and Washington and rejected suggestions that Osama bin Laden could be behind them. He said it's premature to level, the person from the Taliban said it's premature to level allegations against a person who is not in a position to carry out such attacks. It was a well-organized plan, and Osama bin Laden has no such facilities. You about this. This isn't Dennis. This is Larry Bensky. Can I ask you this?
Yes.
Earlier we read a report here from Nablus where people were reportedly, Palestinian Arabs were reportedly handing out candy in the streets, celebrating and shooting guns into the air in celebration.
I haven't seen any of those reports.
Well, it's on the it's on the Reuters wire, and making statements. Many people being interviewed saying that they are glad that the United States could be attacked in this manner. And I'm sure this is all over the cable stations, which I haven't been monitoring.
Speculation should be based in known reality, and the known reality is simply that nobody out there fits the profile of someone who has both the malevolence against the United States institutions and the capability to pull something like this off that we've seen. And so this is something really quite new.
Jane Ibish on Utah Senator Republican Orrin Hatch just speaking on CNN, saying clearly this is an act of war, one that requires that sort of response.
This is a massive attack by criminals who may or may not be based outside the United States, and that's, I think, entirely reasonable. The only problem I have with Senator Hatch's formulation is it assumes an external power, and we did that during the Oklahoma City bombing. We assumed that this had nothing to do with anybody within the United States, and we found out to our shock and our horror that that act was perpetrated by an all-American kid from upstate New York who was trained in explosives by the military.
That's a very good point, and on that point we're going to have to leave it because we've got a local news update that we have to bring you here. Thank you very much for joining us, and as Dennis said, we'll be getting back to you and others later.
Tell me about 9/11 and how that affected you as a New Yorker in a complete sentence. And what were you doing at that moment?
At 8:47 in the morning of September 11, 2001, we were preparing the broadcast of Democracy Now! At the time, we broadcast at 9 o'clock every morning. Now we broadcast at 8. And at 8:47, the first plane hit the first tower of the World Trade Center. We didn't know what had happened. We, at the time, worked out of the garret of this century-old firehouse, downtown community television. It's a decommissioned firehouse. And since we were in the garret, no windows, didn't know what had happened. So we started the show. 3 minutes later, the second plane hit the second tower of the World Trade Center. And we're just blocks from Ground Zero. We're the closest national broadcast to Ground Zero. And we were doing a special that day on the connection between terror and September 11th, 1973, the day Salvador Allende died in the palace in Chile as the Pinochet forces rose to power. So the democratically elected leader of Chile died as the U.S.-backed, Nixon-backed, Kissinger-backed, ITT-backed, Anaconda Copper-backed Pinochet forces rose to power. And that's what we were looking at that day, the connection between September 11th and terror. And then we got a sense of what was happening, couldn't make any sense of it, started to broadcast and saying this was taking place and hearing what was happening in Washington. And we broadcast throughout the day and brought up people who had survived 9/11. And we were within the evacuation zone right here. We're just a few blocks below Canal Street. And so the military was clearing out people, police were clearing out. And so we just hunkered down here so that we can continue broadcasting. And we did over the next few days, because we saw as the war.
This size blast would have produced an incredibly loud sound that was not recorded on videos of the collapse nor reported by witnesses. This size blast would have produced an incredibly loud sound that was not recorded on videos of the collapse nor reported by witnesses. This size blast would have produced an incredibly loud sound that was not recorded on videos of the collapse nor reported by witnesses.
Let me get this straight. First you remove the blast sounds from your videos and then you turn around and report that blast sounds don't exist? This is fucking unbelievable. Why does Amy Goodman refuse to say she was at Building 7 if nothing criminal happened? Is she using this as blackmail, or have we been duped about Amy Goodman all along and she is really with the criminal cabal? We could really use her sound file right now. Can someone please ask her for all of her recordings, that is video and sound recordings of that day? There is no way she went down to Building 7 without the tools of the trade. Why has no one demanded her files? She is an identifiable witness to the crimes of 9/11 and she is surrounded by television recording crews fully packed with recording devices.
This size blast would have produced an incredibly loud sound that was not recorded on videos